All right. Hello, everyone. This is the PowerPoint for Target 7B. So make sure you use this PowerPoint to take notes, especially the vocab words, because those are going to be very important when you take your practice assignment in your test. So for this target, you are going to have to use mathematical representations to support explanations based on evidence about biotic and abiotic factors affecting biodiversity and populations. So essentially that just means that you're going to have to be able to read a graph, read a chart, and talk to me about biodiversity and how abiotic and biotic factors affect the population. So in order to know that, we have to know what abiotic, biotic, and biodiversity means. So that's what we're going to talk about. Alright, so we're going to watch this quick video about what biodiversity is, and then we'll talk about the definition, and then we'll talk about abiotic and biotic factors as well.
Biodiversity is a term that represents the total variety of all life on Earth. That's a big thing to sum up. Thousands of different wild habitats, millions of different species, billions of different individuals, and the trillions of different characteristics they all have. The total biodiversity of our planet is immense, which is a good thing, because the more biodiversity, the more secure all life on Earth is, including ourselves. Only when life is at its most varied, vigorous, biodiverse, can we hope to thrive. We may not know it, but we need towering forests across 1/3 of the land surface to lock away carbon and keep the climate stable. We need millions of pollinators and billions of soil organisms and megatons of plankton to keep the food we eat in supply. We need strange plants deep in jungles to create our medicines, and coral reefs and mangrove swamps to protect the coasts we depend upon. Our planet's biodiversity provides all the things we need for free, but it will only do so if there's lots of it, and at the moment it's under attack. In the last 50 years, our activities have dramatically reduced biodiversity across the globe. We've snuffed out habitats, reduced populations of wild animals by 60%, and even driven whole species extinct. The number of lions in Africa has dropped by 65%. The number of individual flying insects in Europe has dropped by 75%. The number of bluefin tuna in the Pacific has dropped by 95%. Biodiversity is dropping everywhere and fast. This is catastrophic for nature and therefore ourselves. We talk about climate change a lot, but biodiversity loss is as important an issue. How do we stop this loss of life? How do we ensure that biodiversity, our planet's vital statistic, begins to increase again? In fact, we already know exactly what to do.
All right. So that show is called Our Planet if you are interested in watching it. I think it might be on Netflix. I'm not sure. But anyway, so we're going to talk about biodiversity. We're going to get our definition down, and then we'll get, then you'll be able to move on. Okay, so this is our definition for biodiversity, so it's very important that you have it written down somewhere, that you have access to it, because you will need to use it for your practice assignment and your test. So biodiversity is the variety of living things in a particular ecosystem or habitat. So it's just how many living things are there. So you can have high biodiversity, which means you have lots of different types of living things in that habitat, or you can have low biodiversity, which means that you don't have a lot of types of living things in that habitat. But you don't ever have zero biodiversity. It's on a scale, so you either have a lot or you have a little bit, but you don't ever have zero. So if we look at these habitats, we'll do a little bit of a practice. Which of the following ecosystems is more biodiverse and why? So we have ecosystem A, we have ecosystem B. So as you can probably guess and probably tell, ecosystem A has a lot more biodiversity. We can see lots of different types of birds. We can see that there's different types of fish. There's lots of different plants around. So lots of different types of life here. There's even a little butterfly for an insect. For ecosystem B, there's not zero biodiversity, there's just less of it. So we have this type of plants, so a couple plants back there. There's probably some little creepy crawly things rolling around in the sand, but we don't have as much different types of life in ecosystem B as we do ecosystem A. So now we need to talk about the Y part of it. And this kind of gets into like food chains a little bit. You don't really need to know much about food chains, but we kind of look at what do plants need to survive. So we know that plants need sunlight and water. Well, in a desert, there's definitely a lot of sun, but there's not very much water. That's actually what classifies a desert. So it can be cold, and there actually can be not a lot of sun. So like the Arctic is considered a desert, just because it's any area that doesn't get a lot of water. Desert, don't get a lot of water. If we don't get a lot of water, that means there are a lot less types of plants that can survive there. So plants like cacti can survive there because they can store water, so they can survive because they have water inside of their little plant bodies that helps them to survive. But most plants can't store water, so they just can't survive there. Ecosystem A, we have a little lake there, so there's a source of water for animals to drink from, but then obviously we have sunlight. This is probably a place that gets a lot of rain, because you don't really have lakes if you don't get rain. So having lots of water, having lots of sunlight, having lots of humidity, when temperatures are warmer, all of those things typically allow for a lot of biodiversity. When things are cold, when you don't get a lot of water, when you don't get a lot of sunlight, you don't have very much biodiversity, because there are less species that can survive in those more extreme conditions. So let's look at this map. Where is there a lot of biodiversity in the world? So we're looking for places that have this red and these purple bluish colors, and then so those places have lots of biodiversity, and then these more like tannish white colors don't have a lot of biodiversity. So if we look at this map, we can see that like South America has a lot of biodiversity. This area over here, so like East Asia, Thailand, the Philippines, that has a lot of biodiversity. But then you look up here, we have like the, I believe this is Greenland. Where's Alaska? I'm trying to find, oh, there's Alaska. So this area over here, Canada, don't get a lot of biodiversity. Same thing over here when we look at Russia, don't get a lot of biodiversity. Same thing here when we look at Africa, this top part of the African continent, we don't get a lot of biodiversity. So when we look at places like Alaska, Canada, and Russia, the reason we don't get a lot of biodiversity there is because it's very, very cold. So there's lots of ice. We don't get a lot of rainfall or snowfall. So it's hard for different types of life to live there. When we look at this northern part of Africa, we can see that the reason we don't get a lot of biodiversity there is not because it's cold, but because we, again, don't get a lot of rain. So the Sahara Desert doesn't get very much rain at all. So it's harder for different types of animals, different types of plants to be able to live there with no water or very, very little water. So that kind of answers the question, why do those places have more places have biodiversity than the others? These places that have a lot of biodiversity are going to get a lot of rainfall. They're very warm, they're very humid, they're very tropical, they get a lot of sunlight, all the things that like plants need to survive. And if there's lots of plants there, most animals eat plants and other animals. So if there's plants there, then animals can live there. If there's animals that can live there, they can eat the plants and the other animals. So then we have this E-charge. This is not something you need to write down, but this is just going to get us into, it's kind of an introduction for our abiotic and biotic factors. So if something is alive, we say that it's E-charged. It has energy. It needs to be able to use energy. It has to have cells. It has to be able to maintain homeostasis. It has to be able to adapt to its environment. It has to be able to reproduce. It has to be able to grow and develop. It has to be able to evolve. And it has to have DNA. So these are the conditions that we would say, yep, it's alive. If it doesn't have one of these things, then we would say, no, it's not alive. So biotic factors, it's living things that affect biodiversity. So anything that is alive that is going to affect the amount of species that can live there is biodiversity. So for example, insects. Insects are alive. They will affect biodiversity because different birds can eat insects. So if I'm a bird and I can only eat one type of insect, if that insect doesn't live in an area, I can't live there either. But if it does live in an area, that's the area that I'm going to live at. So that's an example of how a living thing could affect biodiversity. That we have plants, we have insects, we have other animals, we have fungi, we have bacteria, are all living things that affect biodiversity. Then we have abiotic things, and these are non-living things that affect biodiversity. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. For our abiotic things, we're not really talking about like a sock. A sock is a non-living thing, but it's not really going to affect biodiversity. It's not going to affect how many species can live in an area. But some non-living things that will affect how many species can live in the area are things like temperature, water, sunlight, weather, natural disasters. Those are all living things, or excuse me, those are all non-living things, but they will very much affect biodiversity. If I don't have a lot of sunlight, I'm not going to have a lot of biodiversity. If I have lots of water, I will have a lot of biodiversity. If I live in an area that gets a lot of natural disasters, there's probably not going to be a lot of animals that can survive there. So like forest fires, if you are in an area that gets a lot of forest fires, the biodiversity is going to decrease. So we're looking for non-living things, but they also have to affect biodiversity. Pollution is a good one too. If there's a lot of pollution in an area, the biodiversity is going to decrease. So when we're talking about ecosystems need biotic and abiotic factors to be able to be healthy and to survive. So we have our non-living things, water, light, minerals, air, soil. We have our living things with plants, protists, fungi, bacteria, animals. So living, non-living things that any ecosystem has to have to be able to survive. So I'm going to skip over this slide. If you would like to practice it, you can, but essentially you are just putting these things in categories. So like sunshine heating the air, you're going to tell me, is it abiotic, ambiotic? Actually, sorry, I'm not going to skip over this slide. We're going to do it together. So that's what we're looking at. We are looking at each of these examples, and I want to see, do these things help affect biodiversity? Are they abiotic? They're both abiotic and biotic, or are they biotic? So again, abiotic is non-living, biotic is living. So sunshine heating the air, that is going to be a abiotic thing. It is non-living, sunshine's not alive, the air is not alive. A wolf hunting a deer, that is going to be biotic. The wolf is alive, the deer is alive. I would try the rest of these on your own first before I go through them, so I'd pause the video and try them, so that way you can check your work to make sure you're on the right track, because that's what you'll have to do for the test and the practice assignment. You'll have to be able to determine if something biotic, it's living, or is it abiotic. So moving on to the next one. Plants growing in the sunshine. This one would be both, because plants are alive, however the sunshine is not. So plants are biotic, sunshine is abiotic. Water falling as rain, that is going to be abiotic. The water is not alive, the rain is not alive, so it's abiotic. Frogs laying eggs in the water, that is going to be both, because the frogs and the eggs that they're laying are both biotic, they're both alive, but the water is abiotic, it's not alive. A mushroom growing on a dead tree, that one is going to be both, because the mushroom that's growing is alive, but the dead tree obviously is now dead, so it would be abiotic. Birds flying, that should say south for at the end of the summer. So birds flying south at the end of the summer, that is going to be biotic. The birds are alive, so they're biotic. And then soil forming rocks, so that one is going to be abiotic. The soil is not alive, the rocks are not alive. So that's just a practice for you, because like I said, that's what you're going to have to do on the practice assignment and the test. Okay, so next steps for this one. You need to go on campus, do the 7B practice assignment, and when you're done with that, you'll do the 7B assessment, and then you are done with Target 7B.